For sure, man was formed from the earth, conceived in guilt, and born to punishment. What he does is depraved and illicit, shameful and improper, vain and unprofitable. He will become fuel for the eternal fires, food for worms, a mass of rottenness. He was born to toil, dread, and trouble, and more wretched still, was born only to die. This rather grim look at human nature comes from Pope Innocent III's On the Misery of the Human Condition. The work examines the reality of man before his redemption and his fate without salvation or sanctification. The sinner's life without Jesus Christ is an endless maze of unfulfilled desires, wretchedness, and death. This may not be popular or even palatable to the modern man who likes to speak of his dignity and enlightenment, but it is still at the heart and foundation of the Christian faith. Man is dead in sin. Yet, as Catholic Christians, we know that the story does not end here. There is redemption in Jesus Christ. St. Paul, in his epistle to the Romans, begins with the same bleak reality that Pope Innocent III describes, but he does not end there. He proclaims, "Likewise reckon you also yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto God through Jesus Christ our Lord." And yet, as Roman Catholics, we do not deceive ourselves by thinking that a mere recognition of Christ's atoning sacrifice is enough for salvation. Rather, we must avoid sin altogether. To have faith in Jesus Christ means to live in Jesus Christ. But our fallen nature is so drawn to the barren state of sinful depravity that we constantly find ourselves wallowing in sin, falling away from God. This is where Venerable Luis of Granada, a 16th century Dominican friar, enters the scene with his great book, The Sinner's Guide. The Sinner's Guide quotes On the Misery of the Human Condition and in many ways serves as its sequel. If On the Misery of the Human Condition is the Inferno, The Sinner's Guide is the Purgatorio. It serves as a way and a path out of the wretchedness of sin and towards new life in Jesus Christ. This is not a book that should be read in one sitting or haphazardly. This has a very specific structure and serves as an aid, an outline to help the sinner amend his life, avoid sin, and grow in virtue. A Catholic must pray. This should be quite obvious, and oftentimes it is, but what's not obvious is how we should pray. If one were to read On the Misery of the Human Condition, and then The Sinner's Guide, and then examine his own sins, he might be overwhelmed. It would be like standing at the base of a mountain, staring at the towering peak, dreading the journey ahead, rather than simply taking the first step. Many spiritual masters recommend that we take on one vice at a time. One of the best ways to do this is through the daily Examen, where one singles out a vice to combat or a virtue to cultivate, and uses meditation and prayer to resolve to do so. A key part of this process is developing strong motives for avoiding sin and growing in God's service. This is precisely how The Sinner's Guide begins, with 11 beautifully illustrated examples to help motivate you to practice virtue. The Spanish Dominican had a gift for vivid imagery, drawing upon the wisdom of the Church Fathers and saints. One particularly striking example near the beginning is the idea and image of, even if the whole world were filled with books, the sea turned to ink, and every creature dedicated itself to writing about God's goodness. And I like to think here of a miracle of even the animals and sea creatures assisting man in doing so. In such an imaginary place, Venerable Luis of Granada says the sea would be drained, every book filled, lifetimes would pass, and still not even one of God's perfections would be adequately expressed in all of the books written put together. And the motives like this one are not meant to be read once and then forgotten, but rather should be carried into meditation and prayer, allowing them to deepen our resolve to avoid sin. Venerable Luis of Granada, like many good Dominicans, understood that people respond best to the idea of rewards and punishments, especially when speaking about religious things. This may not be the most perfect way of speaking about religion, but it is the way that people respond to most. It's the thing that's closest to the heart of man. We tend to view things in a transactional way. So, following the motives for virtue, the Sinner's Guide lays out 12 privileges of those who follow virtue, showing not only the rewards of holiness, but also the consequences of sin. One particularly compelling example comes from the Aeneid. Dido, queen of Carthage, abandons her duties for a lustful love of Aeneas. The city's defenses are neglected, public works collapse, and all of her passions tyrannize her entire person. Venerable Luis of Granada uses this as an image of what sin does to us. What appears to be freedom leads only to slavery. Virtue, on the other hand, grants true liberty, the kind that allows man to master himself and live in accordance with the will of God. And again, I will stress that these meditations should not remain in the abstract. They should be applied in meditation, keeping us on the way towards living a virtuous life. The 5 great deceptions that keep us in sin. The rest of the Sinner's Guide really focuses on practical remedies for sin, beginning with 5 great tricks of the devil that keep sinners bound in their ways. Number 1, the folly of deferring conversion. This was initially the error of St. Augustine, who famously prayed, "Lord, grant me chastity, but not yet." Luis illustrates this with a striking image. A woodcutter in a forest gathers firewood. When the load becomes too heavy to carry, instead of lightening it, he foolishly adds more, hoping that he might somehow find the strength tomorrow. Likewise, the sinner convinces himself that later will be the time to reform his life, only to find that the weight of sin and vice grows heavier with age. Number 2, putting off conversion until death. Many in the early church fell into the error of putting off their baptism until their final moments. They deceived themselves into thinking that they might be saved at the last minute. And Venerable Luis relies heavily on Blessed Duns Scotus here, who gives 4 reasons why this is dangerous, but one chilling example stood out to me. A man known for virtue at the moment of his death could think of nothing but his own fear of death. A priest pleaded with the normally virtuous man to stop worrying about remedies for a hopeless situation, and yet the man could not be consoled, dying as he grasped for any hope of remedying inevitable death. If even a virtuous man can falter in the last moments of his life, I think we should reflect how much more for a man steeped in sin, hoping to find redemption at the end of his life. Number 3, presuming on God's mercy while continuing in sin. This is, of course, a sin against the Holy Ghost, coupling presumption with despair. Venerable Luis quotes St. Bernard, who is sufficient to dispel this error briefly. God has 2 feet, one of justice and the other of mercy. We must embrace both, lest justice without mercy lead us to despair, or mercy without justice lead us to presumption. I find that the final 2 errors, number 4 and 5, often go together. The first being deferring conversion because the path of virtue seems too difficult. This error is easy to laugh off or dismiss because we tell ourselves, well, certainly it's not too difficult for me, especially after reading a spiritual meditation, for example. But when we are actually faced with the choice between an attractive sin that inflames our passions or the practice of virtue, the latter often feels like staring at a blank wall, lifeless in the moment, while the former is, of course, inflaming our passions. It's encouraging us to commit that vice. Sin in the abstract is easy for us to reject, but when temptation actually arrives, when our passions clouds our use of reason, it can seem impossible to resist in the moment. This ultimately reveals our lack of faith, hope, and love, and the best way to counteract this lie of the devil is through acts of faith, hope, and charity. The Sinner's Guide brilliantly exposes the foolishness of this error with a striking analogy. Were a charlatan to assert that he could teach the art of turning copper into gold, how many would eagerly test his method? Yet God himself offers to teach us the art of turning earth into heaven for our eternal welfare, of converting ourselves from flesh into spirit, from men into angels. And how many there are who refuse to listen. Be not of their unhappy number. The last of these errors, which often accompanies the belief that virtue is too difficult, is the refusal to practice virtue out of love for the world. Again, this might seem ridiculous when it's considered abstractly or while we are contemplating God's works, but in reality, the devil frequently exploits this attachment to tempt us away from holiness. A particularly compelling example I found in the Sinner's Guide is how it inverts the promises that Satan made to Christ to show us the foolishness of his errors. When the devil showed Christ all the kingdoms of the world that he was offered, offering him power and riches in exchange for worship, here we see in the Sinner's Guide the image is reversed with the story of St. Cyprian. We are told, St. Cyprian takes a man to a high mountain and points out the lands, the seas, the courts of justice, the palaces, and the public places, all of them filled with corruption and sin. All of these worldly institutions, when viewed with sober judgment, should excite in us not admiration, but condemnation. If we ever feel pulled away from the spiritual life, we should recall how utterly corrupt and fleeting the treasures of this modern world and its false institutions have become. The next part of the Sinner's Guide produces particular remedies for certain sins, such as lust, sloth, anger, and so forth. And we should remember that these remedies are not merely theoretical. They can and should be used in our meditations to help root out vices and cultivate virtue. There are two particular points of emphasis that I want to highlight here. The first is that these specific remedies are prefaced with a general remedy against sin, namely the necessity of a firm resolution not to commit sin. This again might seem obvious, but it actually highlights a distinctive feature of counter-Reformation Catholic spirituality, a kind of warrior spirituality. Unlike certain other traditions that emphasize detachment or removing the imagination, Counter-Reformation spiritual masters placed great importance on using meditation and prayer to stir up vigorous movements of the will against sin. And this is why military imagery is used so frequently throughout Catholic spiritual writings. The spiritual life is warfare. And if we fail to arm ourselves properly with good weapons for the imagination, we will inevitably fail to make these firm resolutions. It should then seem strange to us that so many of the modern self-help guides focus too much on practical day-to-day equations. Even Catholic ones we see ignoring the crucial element of the will's involvement in resisting sin. Today, people often ask, which internet filter should I use, or what diet should I follow to avoid gluttony? And these are practical considerations, and they have their place. But the Sinner's Guide focuses first and foremost on the interior battle, on arming the soul with spiritual weapons. The real struggle takes place in the mind and the will. And if this battle is won, external temptations lose much of their power. The last part of the Sinner's Guide focuses on man's three fundamental duties: his duty to himself, his duty to his neighbor, and his duty to God. This section, while serving as a conclusion, should not be overlooked. Rather, it acts as a sharpening stone to refine all the considerations that have come before. Two especially important themes emerge here that we should pay attention to. Number one, the need to purify one's intention. There is an infinitely vast difference between the monk who performs his duties and tries to grow in virtue because he thinks that's what a monk should do or to impress other people, and the monk who acts virtuously for God alone. At times, we may need lesser, more basic motivations to get us started on the path of virtue. But ultimately, the frequent elevation of the mind to God is necessary. If we remain focused only on ourselves, our own perfection, our own struggles, our own fears, we will stagnate. The mind must be drawn upward, away from the self and toward God. Number 2, the importance of one's duty of state. This is another critical concept that can often be overlooked. The duties of a mother are completely different from those of a nun. If a mother were to neglect her children in order to imitate the prayer rule of a cloistered nun, she would actually be obstructing her path to sanctification, not advancing it. And so, the Sinner's Guide repeatedly stresses prudence, discernment, and the importance of relying on wise spiritual guidance while acting out one's duty of state. The Sinner's Guide stresses that holiness must consider fulfilling one's own vocation faithfully and diligently in order to grow in virtue. The Sinner's Guide is not one of these spiritual books that you can pick up and say, wow, that was beautiful, or you can hope to gain some pious thoughts over time from reading it and just never think about it again. Rather, it serves as a framework. It serves as a blueprint of sorts for growing in virtue. If you're interested in picking up this guide, Tan Books has partnered up with CFN, so you can support us by buying from the link in the description. This helps us to produce more videos like this one and also to produce devotional material in our monthly newspaper. You can also support us by actively sharing this video. As you can probably guess, these kinds of videos, book reviews, and spiritual guides don't generate the same controversy that other videos do. And so we rely on you to share this around, really to gain traction and to get this message out there. This is the foundational point of Catholicism. It's the most important thing that people can gather. So please do help us out by liking, sharing, and commenting below. This is Murray Rundus from Catholic Family News, and may God grant you many joyful years.